This week on the Age of Revolution podcast, we pick up where we left off last week in the aftermath of the first major engagement of the Civil War. Fought on the 21st of July, 1861, the Battle of First Bull Run would be followed by a series of lesser battles that took place along a line running from western Virginia, soon to become its own state, through Kentucky and Missouri. These states were collectively known as border states, a designation recognizing that though they were slave states, they did not secede from the Union. Given their unique political circumstances, these states may be thought to have experienced distinct civil wars within the confines of their own territories. The result was a uniquely rough-hewn and haphazard style of warfare in which ill-trained, ill-equipped, and bitterly divided citizen soldiers squared off in a series of confused clashes. It was from such circumstances, however, that several of the war's more notable leaders would emerge. We begin now with an episode that introduces two such figures, George B. McClellan and Ulysses S. Grant. The day after the Battle of Bull Run, July 22nd, the wreckage of McDowell's army came slogging into Washington in bits and pieces, all of them muddy, wet, and weary. The poet Walt Whitman was a witness. The streets were all over motley with these defeated soldiers, queer-looking objects, strange eyes and faces, drenched and fearfully worn, hungry, haggard, and blistered in the feet. In Willard's Hotel, Whitman heard officers explaining to one another how they happened to return to the capital without their commands. Whitman described the common soldiers with compassion, but the self-serving artifices of these officers incensed him. "There you are, shoulder straps, but where are your companies? Where are your men? Incompetents! Never tell of the chances of battle, of getting strayed and the like. Sneak, blow, put on airs, there in Willard's sumptuous parlors and barrooms, or anywhere. No explanations shall save you. Bull Run is your work. Had you been half or 1/10 worth your men, this would never have happened." In truth, the common soldier, virtually untrained, had made a good stand-up fight at Bull Run. From the first collision on the Sudley Road to the collapse and rout on the Union right, he had been in the fight for nearly 8 hours. A terrible day's work. That he was badly led was unarguably true. Many failures were at the top. Patterson had been baffled in the valley and never reached the field, or even knew that he was urgently needed on the field. McDowell had not managed to get nearly a quarter of his army into the battle at all, nor for that matter did Beauregard. A critical opportunity in front of the Henry House failed because no one could coordinate the pieces of the attack. Many failures were at the company and regimental level as units got lost, disorganized, confused. There were no non-commissioned officers yet who knew what to do when their commanders were put out of the fight. No one had time to learn, let alone master, all the complex evolutions of moving men on the battlefield. McDowell had not been given the time to make an army. General McClellan would be given both the time and the immense resources of the federal government to do so. George Brinton McClellan was just 35 when he was called upon, as he said, to save his country. Short, darkly handsome, compactly and powerfully built, he looked the part of the young Napoleon, as the journalists called him, and he liked to be photographed with a hand tucked into his coat front in the proper Napoleonic manner. A West Pointer, second in his class, he had been brevetted for gallantry as an engineer in Mexico. Able, energetic, and ambitious, he had left the peacetime army, in which advancement was notoriously slow, to become chief engineer and vice president of the Illinois Central Railroad. At 32, he was president of the Eastern Division of the Ohio and Mississippi. When the war came, he was appointed Major General of Volunteers and sent to the mountains of western Virginia. Some thought that he carried an indefinable air of success about him and something of the man of destiny. In May, McClellan commanded the Department of the Ohio, which included Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Western Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Western Virginia represented a strategic opportunity because whoever controlled it controlled the vital rail line eastward to Baltimore. It was also a political opportunity because disaffected mountaineers were on the verge of seceding from Virginia. On May 26, in Cincinnati, McClellan prepared to send his troops into Virginia to take advantage of the opportunity. But first he issued a proclamation. He seems to have enjoyed proclaiming nearly as much as reviewing. The proclamation called on the mountaineers to sever their connection with traitorous Virginia and demonstrate their faith and loyalty to the Union. It was received with much cheering and waving. Then McClellan sent a column south to Philippi. There, on the night of June 3rd, the Federals struck a small, untrained, poorly armed, wholly unprepared Confederate force. Apparently the rebels had even failed to post pickets. It wasn't much of a fight. The rebels went fleeing back toward the mountains in the rainy night, and the Yanks heartily enjoyed what they remembered as the Philippi races. The next day McClellan himself reached the field. He first prepared an address to the troops, printed up on a portable press that went wherever the general went. "Soldiers," he wrote, "I have heard there was danger here. I have come to place myself at your head and share it with you. I fear now but one thing, that you will not find foemen worthy of your steel." At this point the foemen, whatever their fitness, were led by Brigadier General Robert S. Garnett, who fell back, marching up the Tigert Valley toward the mountains. Attempting to defend Virginia from an invasion from the rear, he divided his army to block the passes at Rich Mountain and Laurel Hill. McClellan moved part of his force against Garnett at Laurel Hill, and with the main body moved on Rich Mountain. Once opposite the Federal lines there, he sent Brigadier William S. Rosecrans to strike the rebels in flank. "No prospect of a brilliant victory," McClellan explained, "shall induce me to depart from my intention of gaining success by maneuvering rather than by fighting." Rosecrans's column, after a tough climb up steep slopes, came down completely in the Confederate rear and sent ragtag rebels scattering in confusion with hardly a fight. With Rich Mountain lost, Garnett could hardly hope to hold Laurel Hill, and he retreated northward over the Cheat River, where he was himself killed in a rear-guard action. It was the end, as McClellan wrote in his battle report, of a brief but brilliant campaign. His portable press went to work printing out a lofty victory address. "Soldiers of the Army of the West, I am more than satisfied with you. You have annihilated two armies, commanded by educated and experienced soldiers, entrenched in mountain fastnesses at their leisure. You have proved that Union men are more than a match for our misguided and erring brethren. In the future, I still may have greater demands to make upon you, and still greater sacrifices for you to offer. It will be my care to provide for you to the extent of my ability. But I know now that by your valor and endurance you will accomplish all that is asked." Without question, McClellan had handled his army with a high degree of competence and had won an important victory, securing the Baltimore and Ohio line and helping take West Virginia out of the Confederacy. But there is much in this campaign that casts a long shadow over the kind of general McClellan would become when he came to high command in the East. First, there was something skewed in McClellan's perception of things. When he came to Philippi, he had spoken of sharing the place of danger, but so sudden was the Confederate collapse that there had been but a handful of rebel dead. The Federals lost not a single trooper. McClellan had spoken of valor and sacrifice and endurance, but the men had not experienced much of these virtues. They still thought of a day of battle as one of rare sport. Experience would teach them better. Then there was McClellan's inflation of the enemy's numbers and fitness. Although he outnumbered Garnett fully 2-1, he seems to have believed that he had actually annihilated two large, experienced, and battle-worthy armies. The fitness of those armies Garnett well knew, having previously described the 23 companies of infantry as being in a miserable condition as to arms, clothing, equipment, instruction, and discipline. Further, McClellan's inflation of enemy strength seems to be more than simply the fighter's natural tendency to suppose that the fellow he's just beaten was truly a tough opponent. What McClellan imagined, he believed. Finally, and perhaps most telling, was McClellan's plan of campaign to win by maneuver, not by combat. As he wrote to his wife just before Rich Mountain, he hoped to clear the rebels out of West Virginia and liberate the country without bloodshed, if possible. The general wanted to be the sort of warrior who could win battles without fighting. A footnote to the campaign is worth considering here. One of McClellan's subordinates, General Morris, moving out of Philippi toward the mountains, sent to McClellan asking for reinforcements, to which McClellan returned a curt dispatch. "Do not ask for further reinforcements. If you do, I shall take it as a request to be relieved from your command. I must have generals under me who are willing to risk as much as I am, and to be content to risk their lives and reputations with such means as I can give them." In consequence of McClellan's mountain victory, President Lincoln would call him to Washington to organize the Army of the Potomac, which would be the great achievement of McClellan's career. But among the many trials Lincoln endured through the early war years would be McClellan's ceaseless call for reinforcements and his unwillingness to risk lives and reputations with such means as Lincoln could give him. Setting aside the question of what George McClellan would or would not accomplish at the head of the Army of the Potomac, one thing is clear. In the mountains of western Virginia, he had done something vitally important to the Union cause. For in driving the Confederates out, he had secured the line of the Ohio River where it bordered Virginia, thereby securing two crucial border states, Kentucky and Missouri, that would be vital to the Union if it hoped to suppress the rebellion. The Confederate battle flag serves as a revealing symbol of what the Lincoln administration eventually accomplished along the border in the first summer of the war. At the Battle of Bull Run, a good deal of confusion occurred as a result of the similarity between the national flags each side carried into the fight. Confederates flew the Stars and Bars, a circle of 11 stars on a blue field in one corner with 1 white and 2 red horizontal bars. Through the haze of powder smoke, it was easy to mistake it for the Stars and Stripes of the old Union. After the battle, General Beauregard designed a new battle flag, 11 white stars in a blue St. Andrew's cross upon a red field. This flag would be most widely recognized as a symbol of the Confederacy. Late in 1861, the Confederate Congress officially admitted Kentucky and Missouri into the Confederacy and added 2 stars to the flag, but these additions represented only wishful thinking on the part of the Richmond government. While rebel armies would carry the new 13-star flag all the way to Appomattox, the events of the summer of 1861 would take those states out of the Southern camp for the duration. Meanwhile, Kentucky, the state that had produced both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, as well as the great compromiser Henry Clay, remained deeply divided. Not only were the people deeply divided, but the political situation could hardly have been more confusing. The state had a pro-South governor in Beriah McGuffin, but a staunchly Unionist legislature. Although McGuffin had flatly refused calls for troops from both Richmond and Washington, the state militia, well armed and well drilled, was under the command of Southern sympathizer Simon Bolivar Buckner. Its 10,000 men were likewise distinctly Southern in their sympathies and determined to confront Northern aggression on Kentucky soil. To his dismay, however, Buckner soon discovered that Kentucky soil was also home to an equal number of potential aggressors. Under the command of gigantic William Nelson, a 6-foot, 5-inch, 300-pound lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, 10,000 Unionist home guards were raised, prepared to defend Kentucky against aggression, foreign or domestic. In fact, Kentucky was trying to grope its way through a revolutionary conflict of its own. Its citizens, like those of the United States, uncertain whether they were in the midst of an insurrection or a foreign war. As a further sign of its political confusion, Governor McGuffin, with both houses of the legislature, declared Kentucky officially neutral and announced that it would defend its borders from invasion from both north and south. As the state bordered 3 slave and 3 free states, this presented a considerable challenge. As historian Shelby Foote writes, the people of Kentucky were so violently in favor of peace that they were willing to fight for it. In a special congressional election in late June, the people affirmed their neutrality, but at the same time sent 9 pro-Union men and a solitary secession-minded representative to Washington. As far as Washington was concerned, of course, neutrality was no more valid constitutionally than secession. But as a practical matter, Kentucky was neither quite out of nor altogether in the Union. Into this turmoil, Lincoln sent Major Robert Anderson, defender of the flag at Fort Sumter. Anderson, at 56, was older than his years and in failing health. A Kentuckian by birth, he was reluctant to carry fighting to his native state. If Kentucky left the Union, he said, he would leave the country. But with Kentucky at least not forthrightly out of the Union, he went to organize the Union effort in the Department of Kentucky. With a show of respect for the state's neutrality, he made his headquarters across the Ohio River in Cincinnati. It was a sign of an astute sense of political calculation, an astuteness shared by President Lincoln himself, who, apart from assuring the state slave owners that their property was secure, refrained from disturbing the status quo. Recognizing how delicately the balance hung in Kentucky, and essentially unable to hold the state by force of arms, he was willing to await events for the time being. "I hope to have God on my side," he said, "but I must have Kentucky." In Richmond, Jefferson Davis was at least as anxious as Lincoln about the fate of Kentucky, and perhaps more so as he sensed the steadily rising Union sentiment. Kentucky had, after all, elected a Unionist legislature, and by midsummer Buckner's pro-South militia had disbanded. At this point, Davis turned to Leonidas Polk, lately a bishop in the Episcopal Church, now a major general in the Confederate States Army. Polk, at 55, was a West Pointer from the top of his class, who had left the Army early to pursue a clerical career. His analysis of the situation in Kentucky was quite sound. First, he recognized how volatile Kentucky's contentious neutrality was, and how steadily Unionist sympathy was growing. Like Anderson, he tactfully gathered forces just beyond Kentucky's border at Union City in northwest Tennessee. Second, Polk saw that the strategic key to holding the upper Mississippi Valley, and hence Kentucky, was the high ground at Columbus, from which the Mobile and Ohio Railroad ran due south. But also like Anderson, Polk dared not appear to be the first aggressor on Kentucky's soil. 50 miles north of Polk at Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio River empties into the Mississippi, Union forces were gathered also with a design on Columbus. They were commanded by an obscure 39-year-old brigadier from Illinois, Ulysses S. Grant. In a time when soldiers were expected to affect a military demeanor, Grant moved with a slight-shouldered slouch like the hardscrabble farmer he had been not so long ago. He had taken a military education reluctantly, chiefly to escape his father's foul-smelling tannery in Galena, west of Chicago. And at West Point he was an indifferent student who excelled only in horsemanship. He had served capably enough in Mexico, but the boredom and loneliness of later posts in the West drove him to the bottle, which ended his military career in disgrace in 1854. Although the highest reach of his ambition was simply to teach mathematics at a small college, his career in civil life was distinguished only by a series of failures. When the war came, he was a clerk in his brother's store. Grant was about to take his first step out of a lifetime of obscurity, however. On August 28, 1861, the recommissioned general received an order to occupy Columbus, Kentucky. Meanwhile, Leonidas Polk, believing that Northern aggression was on the march in Kentucky, stole a march on his rival general, arriving in Columbus on September 4th. Though the feat represented a modest tactical victory, it would prove a momentous political defeat for Polk. Although both Northern and Southern aggressors were now on Southern soil, most Kentuckians held the Confederates immediately responsible for the violation of their neutrality. Rightly or wrongly, Polk's act had finally and decisively tipped the political balance. Although throughout the war Kentucky would maintain a secessionist government in exile and thousands of her sons would fight for the South, Kentucky would remain in the Union for the duration of the war. Grant, meanwhile, moved to Paducah at the confluence of the Tennessee and Ohio rivers to confront a possible advance by Polk. When Anderson finally crossed the Ohio and addressed the state legislature at Frankfort, the members of that body moved to expel the Confederate invaders. Lincoln at last had Kentucky on his side. The struggle for Missouri. In the spring of 1861, Missouri was not so evenly divided on secession as Kentucky. 3 out of every 4 Missouri men who ultimately fought did so for the Union cause. But the state was perhaps more violently divided, and in the end it would take hard blows as well as political maneuvering to keep it in the Union. Like Kentucky, Missouri had a pro-slavery, secession-minded governor in Claiborne Fox Jackson. Not so long before, Jackson had led border ruffians in the fight over popular sovereignty. Unlike Kentucky, however, the predominantly Democratic state legislature wanted to go out of the Union with their governor. Opposing them were 2 forces, one in the form of a strongly Unionist state convention which voted down the secession ordinance, and one in the person of Congressman Francis P. Blair, Jr. Blair was not only an able and energetic Union man, he had potent political influence in Washington, where his brother, Montgomery, served as Postmaster General, and his father, Francis P. Blair, Sr., sat in the inner circle of Lincoln's advisors. One consequence of Blair's influence was that it brought to Missouri a 20-year regular army captain eager to strike some blows against treason, Nathaniel Lyon. Lyon was slightly built, but his burning blue eyes and red beard gave him the look of a warrior, and 20 years of command had given him the character. When Governor Jackson called out the pro-South state militia and seized a small federal arsenal at Liberty, Lyon went to work with a will. Learning that a body of militia with some artillery was in camp outside St. Louis, with a design to seize the huge federal arsenal there, Lyon organized 4 regiments of German Americans. On May 10th, stiffened by 2 companies of regulars, Lyon's force surrounded Camp Jackson's 700 militiamen and took the lot of them prisoner without a shot on either side. Only later, when Lyon was marching his prisoners through the streets of St. Louis, would blood be shed. A mob of Southern partisans lined the streets, shouting insults, "Up with Jeff Davis," as well as anti-German invective, "Damn the Dutch," then throwing rocks. Finally, someone in the mob shot one of Lyon's captains, and the soldiers shot back. In the confusion, 2 soldiers and 28 citizens were killed. One of the civilians was a baby in its mother's arms. The incident was a vivid prelude to the vicious guerrilla fighting that would be part of Missouri's agony over the next 4 years. It may be worth noting here that Jesse and Frank James and Bob and Cole Younger, later infamous as outlaws, began their careers in violence in Missouri's partisan wars. Blood shed in the streets of St. Louis by Lincoln's hirelings incited pro-South passions. Though some held out remote hopes that a truce might be arranged in June, Governor Jackson was preparing for Missouri's own civil war. His first war measure was to appoint Sterling Price, a general in the Mexican War and former governor, to command the state's militia. As far as anyone could tell by the beginning of June, Jackson's government was still the legally constituted representative of the people of Missouri. But Lyon was not one to try legal cases in revolutionary times. He marched his force west to the state capital at Jefferson City and simply drove the government and Price's militia out of town before him. By the time Lyon had stopped driving, Jackson was governor of a government in exile, and Price had been backed nearly into Arkansas. The only legally elected political body in control of the state was the convention that had rejected secession back in March. In July, they called themselves to order as the Long Convention, after the Long Parliament of the English Civil War, and governed the state until a new Free State Constitution was framed in 1865. Lyon's bold action may have helped create a strange sort of federalism, but politically and practically, it had kept Missouri in the Union. Lyon thus became the hero of the hour, especially in light of Northern dismay over the Bull Run disaster that July. But tragically for Lyon, he had but another hour to act, this on the banks of Wilson's Creek. By the first part of August, Lyon's own success had put his little army in a perilous spot. He had driven Price to within 50 miles of the Arkansas border, but that also meant that he was now 120 miles from his own base of supply back through Springfield to the northeast. More critically, his 5,500 men confronted a force at least 10,000 strong. The character and composition of these armies say much about the nature of the struggle in that first confused and chaotic battle summer. The smallest but perhaps most significant element of Lyon's army was the corps of Old Army regulars, both infantry and artillery. The largest element, fairly well armed thanks to the arsenal at St. Louis, but virtually untrained, was the German-American regiment. Their brigadier, Franz Sigel, was a professional soldier who had fled Germany after the failed revolution of 1848. The remainder of Lyon's force was an odd mix of Missouri and Kansas regiments, including one 90-day Iowa regiment. Price's army was, if anything, an even odder mix. It included Price's own Missouri Home Guards, one genuine Confederate brigade commanded by Ben McCulloch, a veteran of the Mexican War and a former Texas Ranger, and 4 Arkansas regiments with some artillery. The rest were an odd lot of frontier units known by the names of the men who had raised them or been elected by them: Wingo's infantry, Kelly's infantry, Foster's infantry. There were even units composed of both full-blooded and mixed-blooded American Indians. As for arms and equipment, there may have been no more motley army ever gathered on the continent. General Price himself was described by one of his troopers as a large, fine-looking old bald fellow dressed in common civilian clothes, an old linen coat and yarn pants. Many wore whatever they were wearing when they had hiked away from the farm or the mill. Officers were distinguished from enlisted men by a swatch of flannel on their shoulders. Although 3,000 of Price's men had no weapons at all, those who were armed carried everything from modern rifled muskets to flintlocks that had seen service in 1812, to fowling pieces. Lacking cartridge boxes, they carried what ammunition they had in their haversacks. For the most part, they were virtually untrained, undrilled, unorganized, and utterly unprepared for the battle they were about to fight at Wilson's Creek. By the first week of August, Lyon was acutely aware of his predicament. His army was short on supplies, without expectation of reinforcement, facing 2-to-1 odds, and more than 100 miles from the nearest place of safety. If he retreated, Price and McCulloch had every opportunity to outmarch him, get in his rear, and overwhelm him. As Lyon himself put it tartly, "I find my situation extremely embarrassing." He could neither remain where he was in Springfield, nor safely retreat northeast to Rolla. He therefore made a bold decision to attack the rebels in their camp on Wilson's Creek, 10 miles south of Springfield. In the face of a superior enemy, he would divide his force and strike the rebels front and rear. 2 summers later, Robert E. Lee would employ a similar tactic to win his most brilliant triumph at Chancellorsville. But Lee that day would rely on his inspired subordinate, Stonewall Jackson. Lyon would have to rely on the inexpert Franz Sigel. Lyon's plan called for Sigel's German brigade to make a night march, get south of the Confederate camp, and strike it at sunrise. At the same time, Lyon would strike the camp from the north. On the evening of August 11, Sigel's column of 1,200 marched off in the drizzly darkness. The next morning it was in line of battle south of the camp. North of the camp, Lyon with 4,200 men waited to hear the first shots of Sigel's attack. Meanwhile, in the Confederate camp, a change of command had taken place, a measure of the political confusion and general military disorganization of the day. Sterling Price was a major general, but his commission came from Claiborne Jackson, then refugee governor of a shadow government. Ben McCulloch was a brigadier general, but his commission came from President Jefferson Davis. Price and McCulloch exchanged some angry words, but in the end Price agreed to fight under McCulloch. In fact, at Price's urging, McCulloch ordered an attack of his own on August 9, but it rained that night. Considering all those paper cartridges and cloth haversacks, he canceled the attack. The next morning, the Confederate plan was a moot point. Sigel's attack got off capably at daylight. Supported by artillery, he pitched into a camp of Confederate cavalry and drove them. Pressing forward slowly onto open ground, Sigel was struck head-on and sharply by McCulloch's counterattack. The watchword of the German regiments was, "Wie feit's mit Sigel?" But they had done all the fighting they were going to do that day. The brigade broke into fragments, flying in every direction, Sigel himself riding hard for Springfield. North of the creek, Lyon struck Price along a little ridge, and the two battle lines hammered at each other on a narrow front, just a half-mile wide. Because so many were armed with short-range smoothbores, the lines had to come to close quarters to do any damage. All morning they fired in each other's faces, and the little ridge became known as Bloody Hill, the first such homely country place to earn that adjective in the Civil War. In the midst of this vicious fight, however, there was an odd moment of old-fashioned gallantry. In front of the 1st Ohio Regiment, a Texan rode chivalrously to retrieve a lost flag in the face of nearly certain death. The Iowans, chivalrous themselves, held their fire. Elsewhere, Price and Lyon both rode up and down their lines, but the fire apparently was hotter on Lyon's side. He was wounded twice, and his horse shot from under him. Finally, while trying to press his attack forward once more, Lyon was tumbled from his horse with a bullet through the heart. After Lyon's death, the Federal line slowly and stubbornly gave way, beaten but not routed by the weight of Confederate numbers. The battle was over, and there was no pursuit. Having first fallen back upon Springfield, the next day the Federals retreated still further to Rolla. Tactically, the battle was hardly decisive, but one thing was clear. Untrained and poorly organized armies had fought with a terrible tenacity. Here in the West, people were also learning what Bull Run had taught the people back east. The human price of this conflict was going to be steep. In killed, wounded, and missing, each side lost about 1,300 men. Wilson's Creek had been, as one Confederate remembered, a mighty mean-fought fight. Although Confederate forces would threaten Missouri several times in the next year, Price would even seize and hold Lexington for a time. They would never control the state. Lyon had lost the battle, but he had won Missouri. Now the Union command would return to its first objective in the West, to control the upper Mississippi and its tributaries, and to open the avenues of invasion of the upper South.